Hello, and welcome to the Motorsport Magazine podcast. We are at CSM. Looks a bit slightly different to our usual setting. On my right is Simon Aaron, features editor of Motorsport, and to my left is a man who's been called a pioneer, an icon, the Marlboro man, often just Hoagie, though. It's John Hogan. So we are at CSM, as I said. How come you still dip in and out of Formula One? Can't keep away?
Can't keep it. One, I can't keep away, and two, I keep getting asked to come and talk to people about things. So that's what I do. I'm a consultant for CSM.
In terms of chasing sponsorship and
that
deals?
As well, but essentially using your address book to look up and annoy old friends and things like that. You know. And
your journey to this point has been varied and taken very different avenues and different elements of Formula One, but it started at Aintree.
That was the first Formula One race I went to.
Yeah,
it was the Aintree 200. I remember some, Sterling Moss was driving, Jack Brabham was driving, the BRMs were there, the Maserati was there, 250F. I don't know who was driving that. Probably Jean Bérard. Actually, not Jean Bérard. He was driving the Ferrari. 250F. Don't know. But I saw the Vanwells, not in 57, but in 58 there, because I went back the next year to see the race as well. But it was in those days they used to have, which I'm sorry to say they don't anymore, non-championship Formula One races, which were you weren't compelled to enter like you are in a proper Formula One race. You turned up as sometimes as a private owner and thing, and it was a fascinating time.
Can I just ask how? I mean, you were born in Australia. How did you pitch up in what was then called Lancashire, now Merseyside, in the late 50s?
God, my father was in the army. We travelled to Japan. We lived in Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore. Then I went to school in the UK, and I got very friendly with my best friend at school was a guy called Malcolm McDowell, who was called Malcolm Taylor. That was his real name, but Malcolm McDowell, the actor. And his father had a pub, hotel, fairly near Aintree, and so that's how I sort of came to it.
It wasn't some sort of pre-existing passion. It was just.
Oh yes, no. I'd been always interested in motorsport. As I said, I lived in Singapore as a child, and it was pretty primitive in those days because we're in the army and there was no entertainment or magazines or newspapers or anything like that. But there was one copy of Autocar in the house, and I used to read it cover to cover every day. And at the time I was probably 13. No, I wasn't. I was 11. And I can remember it was Sterling Moss had won the French Grand Prix in a 250F Maserati, which probably must have been 56 or something like that. So that's how it all came about.
Living in Singapore at that time, did you get to see any races on the old McDonald Road road circuit?
No. The only motor race I saw in Singapore was actually a hill climb. And the most exciting thing in the hill climb was a Cooper JAP engine, and horrible thing, but it did make a lot of noise. But that was the only car of any note in the whole event.
You're when you came over to the UK, kind of timed it exactly the same time as the Aussie invasion of Brabham and McLaren, and it was a bit of a coincidence, or did that kind of pique your interest also?
No, I'm not that old. I mean, the Australian invasion came after that because I wasn't a dentist or anything like that. Jack and Bruce essentially came over at the end of the 50s.
Yep.
Beginning of the 60s, because Jack had won the world championship in 59?
59. Yep.
Yeah. So that and then he heralded the colonial invasion,
And then,
which was quite extraordinary. I mean, 1 year in Monaco, which must have been early 60s sometime, there was 16 colonial drivers on the grid at the start of the Grand Prix. And they used to include South Africans and Rhodesians in those, but it was quite amazing.
So was it a coincidence that you ended up when you got to Marlboro that you were falling into the Formula One circles?
Well, I eventually went out and got a proper job.
Yep.
And I was working in advertising, and one of the agencies I was working with, which was called Wazy's, had the Coca-Cola business, and there was a couple of guys at Coca-Cola said to me, "Oh, one day, you know a bit about motor racing, don't you?" I said, "Well, a bit." So they said, "Can you have a look at it, for us?" And so I was off, and got to know some people in motor racing, and one thing led to another. I mean, the biggest plus was that through that contact, I could actually get in free. So I was going to every motor race that you could find.
And your work with James Hunt later on, was that separate?
No, that was coincidentally the same thing.
Right.
I was sitting in my office in Wazy's one day, and a guy phoned me up and said, "There's somebody in reception who wants to see you." I said, "Well, who's that?" Anyway, long story short, it was this bloke called James Hunt who'd heard of me through somebody else, because they were intrigued by the fact that I knew something about advertising, and that I also knew something about Formula One and motor racing. So sponsorship was all the rage then. Could we put two and two together and come up with three, sort of thing. And so I spoke to James, and that was a first step.
Yep. And then you at the same time you were striking up a friendship with Ron Dennis.
No, Jerry Birrell was
Birrell.
the other person
Yep.
that I was doing with a lot. I mean, Jerry was the real hot shoe because he'd won the Formula Ford European Championship, I think, and he'd won it easily. So he, everybody revered him, and then I met Ron through all that because Jerry knew Tim Schenken, and Tim was driving for Brabham. No, he wasn't. He was driving for Sports Motors, right. Midlands Formula 2 / Formula 3 team, and which was effectively the Brabham Formula 2 team. And so, through being friendly with Tim, got introduction to Ron Tornak. He's a very special guy.
And still going strong as well.
Still going strong. I read that somewhere the other day. I think it was in one of your magazines. Yeah. I mean, I've never seen a car being driven on the road quite so fast.
I once asked him how to get to Ennepegusa, and he said, "Follow me." And within about 3 minutes,
you'd lost him.
Gone. Yes,
He'd
absolutely.
Gone. Yeah. No. I had a similar experience going up to Silverstone. Going up the back way, and you end up in front of Stowe.
Yes.
I was trying to follow him up there. I mean, he was just through, and there's all those junctions. He's flat through every one of them.
And he's made it into his 90s.
Yeah, it's okay. It'll be all right. Don't worry, mate. It'll be good. You know.
You knew, I guess, Ron Tornerac and then Ron Dennis.
Well, no, I mean, I knew Ron Tornerac. I didn't know Ron Tornerac. I was introduced by Tim to Ron Tornerac, and Ron. I mean, I didn't know at the time that he was probably angling to sell the Brabham team at that point, but he was asking me about sponsorship and how it worked and so on and so forth. So it was a little bit the blind leading the blind, and so that was how that came about. But and Ron Dennis he was the official Brabham Formula 2 team at that point. And Graham Hill was one of the drivers, as was Tim Schenken. I think that's right in saying that, or probably not. I'm not sure.
No, I think that is correct.
I mean, there were races when Graham, Thruxton is a race I remember. It was Graham and Tim were driving.
And then with Marlboro, was it slightly later they were then teamed up with the likes of Williams and BRM, but that was slightly before you arrived at
That was
Marlboro?
that was done before I arrived. I was glad to say. I joined Marlboro in September 1973, and Marlboro had already done a deal with BRM, and part of the thinking behind that was actually fairly interesting. A guy called Ronnie Thompson, who was an international rugby player, was the president of Philip Morris at the time, and therefore he's very sports oriented. And he liked the way Frank thought and talked, and so that was Frank's sponsorship sort of taken care of. And then the BRM situation was even more interesting, because one of Ronnie's ideas was to have a driver of a different nationality in each car at each different race. So that's why we ended up with sometimes 3 cars in a field,
sometimes 5,
five, with a Dutchman, a German, an Austrian, an Australian, everything all in the same all in the same team. It was an interesting idea. I wouldn't just poo-poo it out of hand, because given that the entry in a Grand Prix in those days was quite low, I think it was about 16 on average, so they weren't exactly struggling to fit you in the field, but it gave, and this is what Marlboro were really after, it gave them an international feel to the whole thing. And just remember that in those days, no television. No television. So other than that, trying to find out the results from phoning up the newspapers on a Sunday night. I used to do this, phone up the newspapers on a Sunday night, get put through to the sports desk, and you'd say, can you tell me who won the Formula 2 race at Zolder? And they'd tell, but that was the only communication.
So was winning Monaco the ideal place for them, really, because it's the biggest race?
Well, it was, you're right, it was the only, let me get it correct, I think it was the only race that got on TV. Right. Because ABC, who were the rights holders at the time, would only televise 3 events: Monaco, Indianapolis 500 and Le Mans. Hard to argue with. Yeah. If you're looking for international coverage, it's not a bad way to go.
Nowadays, it's estimated that Mercedes-Benz spends about $350 million per annum on its Formula One program. Can you remember what the sort of Marlboro sponsorship budget was, the first contract you were involved with, which was, I guess, was probably the McLaren one in '74?
Yeah. I mean, it's tiny. I mean, to be honest, I can't remember. But if it was more than $5 million, I'd be very surprised. I think it was in that order, and then it gradually ratcheted up over the years, thanks to Ron Dennis.
I was going to say Ron was probably the major trigger for that, wasn't he? Yes, yeah.
What separated BRM Marlboro to McLaren Marlboro? Was it simply money, or how did it explode into such a big?
Well,
enterprise?
We could see. Yeah, we could see. I mean, it was pretty evident that we could see that BRM weren't going to be around for long, right? I mean, they were struggling. They had some very good engineering. They really did, as you probably can remember, or you wouldn't because you're too young. But they really did have some very good engineering. But there wasn't somebody there wringing it by its neck and actually making it happen. So we just knew we had to go. We had to go, or they had to go, one or the other. And so the McLaren team was around and available. And it was, you could see that it was a very good team, car drivers. So with a few minor adjustments, Yardley could only afford one car, so they left. They moved sideways, and Rob Walker ran the car with Mike Hellwood, and we had the main team with Emerson and Denny Holm.
Yeah,
which was great fun.
And when you first raced together, Denny won the first, and you won the first.
Yes, he won the
Argentinian
Grand Prix, didn't he? Yeah. Well remembered.
I was 13 by then. I'm not going to forget that.
Yeah.
How big a shock was it when Fittipaldi left?
Were
you working on a backup, or was it this is
no, it was he left cold turkey.
Yeah.
I mean, he really did leave absolutely cold turkey, and so I can remember as clear as anything. I was at home, and phone goes. Teddy Mayer says, we've just lost Emerson. He's decided to go and drive a Coppersucker, or Cocker as it was called. You can cut that bit. And so we sort of mumbled about the options. So the options were James Hunt or Jacky Ickx. I never told James this, but I voted for Jacky Ickx. Anyway, so in the end we went with James, and I had the task of going and finding James. This is a Saturday night and a Saturday wet night in London. Where do you start? In the mid-70s. So I phoned his home in Spain, and his wife, I think, answered the phone, and said, "Oh, you might find him here or there or there." Anyway, I found him at Hesketh, and he was entertaining Jane Burbeck at the time. And so I went round there. I went round to the house, and he tried to play hard to get. And I thought, you haven't got any options. It's either this or you can go and drive a Lotus. And I knew he didn't want to drive a Lotus. I mean, there was quite a superstition about driving a Lotus in those days, because so many of them had accidents. And anyway, I knew you didn't want to drive a Lotus, so that was my card. Cut a long story short, we got a deal signed and sealed by the middle of the following week.
What you said initially, you favoured signing Ickx. What were your reservations about James?
Oh, it wasn't any reservation about James. It's just I knew Ickx was a very good driver. I mean, Ickx had he was second in the German Grand Prix the year before, something like that. I mean, he was very good. He was really very good, and so it was as simple as that. A judgment deal. Cool.
A lot's made of the clothes question, with James not being willing to adhere to Marlboro's shirt, trousers.
Yeah, no, that was interesting.
How did you get around that? Or
well, we played poker again. He said, I can't wear that shit." I said, "Well, you're going to have to, well, no, I can't. Well, no, I can't pay you." Oh, okay. So that was.
And talking of clothes, when I think of Marlboro in the pits, you see the red trousers, the white shirts. That was kind of one of a kind at the time. What was the reception of the other team? Did they look at the Marlboro guys and think, "Look at those"? Or was it?
In fairness, I think JPS might have beaten us to the draw on that stuff, because they were all in black, weren't they?
Yeah.
And so I think that was one step ahead. I've always kept my eye on Penske, Roger,
yep,
as a sort of a guide to all these things. And for years, Roger had the smartest turnout,
yep,
forever in the whole of motor racing. So I always kept an eye on him, and Roger was quite close to McLaren in those early days, and so I picked up little hints from that and said, well, that's the way to go. You've got to be smart. Ferrari, who were the top dog, so to speak, in Formula One, they were still walking around in shell khaki overalls, which looked smart, but they just look smart,
Was that the difference between Marlboro and the other brands that were sponsoring them? They just made it that little bit more professional, that little bit more tidier. And
yeah, exactly. That was the real difference. We wanted to look slick. I'm quite interested from a marketing man's perspective, given that, as you said earlier, that's an assumption.
Given that there was, I remember the British Grand Prix, if it was on at all, they'd show 5 laps, then they'd go back to Haydock Park to show the horses walking around the flipping parade.
Yes, I know.
They weren't even racing.
I know.
So, where was the value? I know you could advertise in papers and on TV in those days and magazines, but where was the value for Marlboro?
Well,
because it was still an underground sport, relatively.
Yes and no. We could see that advertising, as it was termed, was basically coming to an end, and we needed to be in and make ourselves known in the marketplace. And Formula One and motor racing in general was, one of the ways to go about it. And so that's basically what they did. In other words, trying to get everything out there before the black curtain came down. Simple as that.
So did that make you kind of front load the sponsorship money at the beginning?
No, we didn't actually, as it happened. We were the only show in town. I think that's the thing to remember. So everybody was happy to talk to us, which changed over time,
Including Bernie? How was Bernie in the sort of early days? Was he looking...
Well, Bernie was Bernie, He'd tell you that on the first hand, "I don't want you blokes in this at all. You make everything look untidy. Leave," you see. And then he said, "But I can do a good deal with you." So there was always that dichotomy with Bernie.
How was your personal relationship with Bernie?
Fine. Still is.
Did you ever kind of two strong personalities, both pushing the same way?
Oh, we had lots of fights.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. But with Bernie, he's the sort of person you're always going to have disagreements with on principle, on matters of fact, etc.
And I guess the same goes with Ron Dennis.
Ron, yeah, exactly the same. Yeah, exactly the same.
Was there a lot of sort of in the early days when you were lots of blow-ups and?
No. Ron is still a great learner. He absorbs things, he watches and understands, and So Ron in the beginning was all eyes, were just wanting to learn how things worked and go. And Ron became awkward and principled towards the end.
So were you investing in Ron as much as anything else when you sort of orchestrated the takeover? Were you investing as much into Ron as you were the future of McLaren?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, without Ron at that point, McLaren didn't have a future. All the just for example, all the cars were very much of muchness in those days in terms of engineering. I mean, they were all Cosworth engines, all aluminium tubs, etc. But you could see, or you knew that Ron was the person who was really going to make a difference. And when he and John Barnard came along with the carbon fibre proposition, then you had to pay attention.
How did that conversation go when you're almost elbowing Teddy Mayer out of McLaren, and how did
Teddy Mayer was a gentleman. Teddy was knew that things were getting really tough for him and his team, and that he realised he needed new blood. Didn't like Ron. He didn't particularly like Ron. Ron didn't like him much, but there was respect. And had all things being equal, Teddy would have gone for Ron anyway. Top of which, Teddy had John Barnard, and John had previously worked at McLaren on the M23, so there was some feeling of homeliness there, and so it became quite a natural fit in the end.
And in terms of the persuading Marlboro, was there any persuasion needed at Marlboro to make sure that the money was given to Ron to take over McLaren?
Yeah. I mean, not persuasion as such. I mean, didn't have to bend their arms up their back or anything. My job was to keep everybody totally informed in a very logical way, to tell them, what was happening. To explain that, things were changing. Things in Formula One were changing, and these were the options. That's what you did.
Yeah. We've had quite a few questions from readers about that similar sort of time, about Gilles Villeneuve.
Gilles.
Yes. There's the famous story about the pit lane and the pit boards, the negotiations. A couple of people have asked if you were involved in that little charade, I guess, when I think Ron countered an offer with a pit board put in 2.5, and then Gilles changed the 2 to a 3, and then...
To be honest, I don't know that.
Okay.
It's one of the stories I don't know. It doesn't sound very plausible, right, I must say. Gilles did flirt with us. I mean, Gilles started with the M23 as a guest appearance, and made a very spectacular debut, which resulted in him going to Ferrari. Some years after, about 2 or 3 years after that, Gilles rang us up and said, Ferrari is such a handful, blah, 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 blah. And I think it was a handful. So he said, I'd love to come and drive a McLaren. God knows why, because the McLaren wasn't any better. I think a lot of rumours sprung out of that.
Did he get? How come they didn't sign him in 77?
Why did we sign him?
Yes,
because we had Patrick Tambay.
Simple as that.
Yeah, we were looking for a more European, better known driver. I mean, remember, Villeneuve at that point, nobody knew who he was from a Formula 3 driver, you know.
So what did James tell you about Gilles, or did he?
That's an interesting story, because James and Alan Jones went to drive in a Formula Atlantic race.
Yep.
Things drivers do for money. Went to drive in a Formula Atlantic race at Trois-Rivières in Canada. And this bloke, Villeneuve, absolutely blew the pair of them off. You know, 2 world champions got zapped by this Canadian nobody had heard of. And anyway, James, who was always interested in young, up-and-coming drivers, it was his hobby almost, said to me when he got me, he said, you should look at that guy, he's just fantastic. Believe me, he's fantastic. He zapped both Jones and I. You know, so...
Did James know to come to you rather than the team?
Well, we were the team. I mean, we all worked as a team. You know, the team is a team and the sponsor is a sponsor, and we knew we had a collective job to do.
Yeah.
Just moving forward a few years, you said that keeping an eye on young drivers was a bit of a hobby for James. I mean, I worked with him quite a bit during the 1980s when he was looking after Irvine, Hacken and McNish, people like that, the Marlboro juniors.
Yeah.
I mean, he was really, I mean, he seemed very actively engaged at the track.
Yeah, he was.
Working with them. And I guess it was a frequent channel of communication with you guys, keeping abreast of their progress. He was properly into it.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I'd like to think that we were a little bit ahead of the game. I mean, now all teams have got junior teams and things like that. And we just had drivers that we'd spot and keep an eye on and help them along, sort of thing. And he was instrumental in guiding us in that area.
Well, it was like a prototype.
Didn't always get it right.
Well, I mean, it was like a prototype Red Bull system, except you never ran out of drivers. But I mean, of the Marlboro-sponsored youngsters that actually made it through to the Marlboro, was it Mika Hakkinen got through, but not many of the Marlboro-sponsored youngsters. They got into Formula One with other teams and things, but not all that many of them sort of stayed with the Marlboro family, did they?
No, because you couldn't really do that in those days because you didn't have enough cars. I mean, you'd get the bloke into Formula One, stay friendly with him and so on and so forth, and hope he'd succeed. And that's frankly all you could do.
So it was more of a marketing exercise than trying to groom drivers for Marlboro McLaren.
Absolutely.
We had a question actually about De Cesaris, asking why Marlboro stuck with him for so long.
He was potentially very quick. That was it. You know, he was quite quick, and he where did he end up? Alpha.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, under our auspices, he ended up at Alpha. Then he went to Ligier, I think, at the end. But no, we stuck with him for a number of... But you see, that's a good example. We're always friendly with him right to the end. So that was important.
And then talking of quick drivers, Senna, in the late... Did Ron come to you to say, if you want Senna, you have to pay him... Was it 25 million? Was it an easy yes? I assume it was.
It was the way Senna came to us was a bit more contorted with that, and this was Senna came to us through a guy called Domingos Pitardi, and Domingos, who again is a spotter. I mean, he's a businessman in his own right, but he's also a spotter. Came to me one day and said, listen, I've got this young Brazilian. He said, I promise you, he's remarkable. So I said, all right, so we'll have a look. So we did a little contract with him. I think it was $10,000 or something like that to wear a Marlboro badge. And so that meant that we had hold of Senna, that we had an opportunity to talk to Senna as he progressed. That's very valuable. Then Senna was very independent, shall we say, and we had a test day at Silverstone for up-and-comers. Senna was part of that up-and-comer. And of course, what did he do? He blew them all into the weeds, the whole lot of them, you see. But, unbeknownst to me, Ron had already made his mind up who he wanted. Which was Jonathan Palmer.
Right.
Don't know why Ron wanted Jonathan Palmer, but anyway. Must ask Jonathan that one day.
Of course, Senna then drove for two different...
Senna then said, well, I don't want to drive for McLaren anyway, I want to drive for Lotus.
Camel Lotus. JPS Lotus.
JPS Lotus, yeah. So that's how that all came about. And then, of course, he came back to McLaren through Honda.
Right. So the 25 million didn't come from Marlboro?
No. There was no huge amounts of monies to begin with. It got demanding towards the end of his career when, you remember in those days, everybody was playing chess with engines and chassis and designers, and it was going all over the place. Honda had offered the engine in a tortuous, deal to McLaren, which included Prost. I can't remember the exact details of it, but that's how it all came about. When we ran out, or when the team ran out of engines at one point, because Honda had pulled out
at the end of 1992, yeah.
Correct, and so Ron was stuck with making the best of a Cosworth that he could, and Senna. This was the sort of the 5-card trick. I'm not driving with you guys until I've got the best engine. We can't get you the best engine. Doesn't matter. I'm not driving. So, which we said, well, that's fine. How much do you want to drive? So it was all about money. In the end, we said to him, okay, $1 million a race. So that became the rate card.
Right. Where did the Penske test come into that? Because we had a question from a guy called Entropy asking how much involvement you had in that.
Well, it was because it's all more. Penske was Marlboro at the end of the day, and I think Ron just rang Roger and said, "Listen, I want to set down a baseline for Ayrton in an IndyCar to see what he's like." Remember that at that point in time, there was this tremendous pushing and shoving going on between IndyCar and Formula One car. IndyCar was being written up on a regular basis as being the successor to Formula One. So, you had to react to that. You had to make sure that Formula One got its just desserts.
So it was just you and Senna that went to America?
Oh, no. Ron did a lot of pushing and shoving on that as well.
And Senna said at the end of that, I've learned what I need to know. What did he mean by that, do you think?
Whether we could afford it or not.
Right.
That's probably as simple as that. There was no science involved.
During the heat of the Senna-Prost era at McLaren, did you manage to maintain a good, strong relationship with both of them? And if so, how?
Charm. No. Yes, I mean, I must say, I'd feel quite comfortable if Alan Prost walked in here now. We'd be old friends. I mean, we speak on a regular basis when I get dragged along to a Formula E race or something. No, we're friends. Senna, absolutely friends. Absolutely.
I mean, but how did you keep yourself away from the politics?
The politics between who and whom?
Well, between I mean, Ayrton and Alan, obviously, they reached a point where they weren't speaking to each other, and they were communicating via their engineers who were,
That was quite easy. You just say, listen, that's your problem. And it really was their problem. If they couldn't talk to each other, then fine.
I think moving forward to when Marlboro and McLaren split, it was quite a strange situation then when you had Ron had West kind of at the end of a phone and you had Ferrari basically signed and ready to go. How did that conversation go with Ron? I suspect it would be quite easy with Ron. You just say, I'm leaving, and he'll say, okay.
It was a bit of an Arnold Schwarzenegger conversation. Hasta la vista, baby. Yeah, it was that. I mean, I knew he had Ecclestone on a plane up to Germany, literally an hour after I told him it was the end of the road. Simple as that.
And was it always going to be Ferrari? Was there anything that would have persuaded you to stay?
Well, put it another way around. There was no alternative. It was in the garagistas field, as Enzo Ferrari used to call them, that there was only McLaren, and it was either McLaren or Ferrari, or one or the other, or both.
Yeah. There's a question here about when Ferrari later on had Marlboro on the car, but the word Marlboro wasn't anywhere near the car. On the actual car. Was that because it was Ferrari it worked, or because the association of Marlboro and Ferrari had been there so long that Marlboro could stay on the car without his name actually on it and still have the benefits of it? Or were there no benefits of Marlboro staying on the Ferrari into the 2000s?
So let me just go back to the very early stages, because I think you're jumping around in terms of dates.
Yeah.
To begin with, the deal we did with Enzo Ferrari himself was, I mean, he was always a great games player. So I said, we want a bit of Marlboro on the car. This is very difficult. His great quote was, "Don't forget, you're talking about the Pope, not the Archbishop of Canterbury." So there was that. So anyway, long story short, I keep saying that, but they are long stories. He said you can have something the size of a postcard. Let's start with the driver's name.
Okay.
So Peroni, right in the Marlboro badge, and that's how it started. Over time, I just ratcheted it up until I got the back wing.
Yeah.
Got the back wing, then I wanted the whole car. Can't get the whole car, but you could get a design on the car that looked like the whole car.
Yeah.
And so that's what I did.
Thinking of current sponsorship in Formula One, the last few years, if you look at the Sauber a few years ago, had zero branding at all. It had their anniversary on the side. Where's the money gone?
Gone, or where's it coming from?
Well, both. Where did it go? And is it going to come back?
Income in Formula One to the teams is quite substantial. So they're not exactly scratching along on their bum. They've all got enough to survive a season on, and maybe more than one season. Now, the secret is to get more money, and that's where sponsorship comes into play. I mean, Frank is struggling at the present time, not got a lot of money, not got a lot of sponsorship. But nevertheless, it's survivable. So that's quite a straightforward example.
So you think there's a future for Formula One without sponsors, potentially?
No, there'll always be sponsors. It's just sponsors come at it in different ways. I mean, remember, going back into the dark ages, there were no sponsors. On the Brabham Cooper, on the Cooper that Jack drove, there was an Exxon or Esso Tiger on the side. That was because the team was sponsored by Esso. Believe it or not, I mean that was their sponsorship.
Yeah,
it's something that takes on different involvements.
Where do you think the next money could come from? Because there's a question here, can't remember who it was from, but is that the you've had oil come and go,
oil companies, cigarette companies, banks, finance companies.
Is the future technology companies, in that you could have a Google car or a Facebook car?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I've often asked myself that. And those companies are selling a different sort of a proposition. I don't know what. If you had Google on a McLaren, for the sake of argument, I don't know what that adds. Google is a hugely big, well-known brand name in the world.
Bigger than Formula One?
In a way. Unless you can think of some other reason for it for being, then I'm not sure it works.
Well, Yahoo were on the Prost in the early 2000s. It didn't do them a great deal many favours, did it?
That's right. What happened to Prost?
Well,
Bang.
And Yahoo almost as well.
Yeah.
So that question was from Steve Brockbank, so I should credit that to him. Quick one about Jaguar, if that's okay. I read a quote that you said they should have gone to Le Mans rather than Formula One.
Absolutely.
How close did they get?
Because it's part of their knitting. You see, I always believe companies and sports undertakings should stick to their knitting. Stay what you're good at. The only motor racing company in the world that's been good at Formula One and Le Mans is Ferrari. Exceptionally. And I think Jaguar tried to, follow that, and it was never going to work because they had no DNA in Formula One.
Was there resistance to the Le Mans question? Well, I guess there was. I guess it didn't happen. But.
There you go. I never felt. I mean, in fairness to Jaguar, they were being pulled this way and that way at the time because they were partially owned by Ford and this and that, and Ford didn't want to do this because they'd done it with the GT40 and So it's not fair on the management of Jaguar. I think left to their own devices, they would have gone back to Le Mans.
And of course, you replaced Niki Lauda there. In a weird way.
I didn't. Yeah.
Did that ever come up?
Yeah, he got the money. I didn't. That's
I think we're running out of time. So one quick question to finish. Actually, two quick questions to finish. Were you a Marlboro Reds or a Marlboro Lights man?
Lights.
That's from Matt Endon. And one question from
sounds
Bede
like
Phillips.
A former brand manager.
Bede Phillips, who asked quite a few questions, which I hope we've answered for you. Do you have a plan to write a book about what you've done?
No. I'm too busy being interviewed by you guys.
Excellent. Simon, anything to add?
No, just thank you very much for your time. It's been great.
Not at all.
Yeah, thank you.
Was that a quarter of an hour?
Yeah. Yeah. So thanks for joining us. Thanks for sparing your time. Thanks to CSM for hosting us. Thanks, Simon. Thanks, Alan. We'll be back soon with a MotoGP season review, I hope, and hopefully a Formula One season review. So do subscribe, and we'll see you soon.